The sun rose the way it always did, slow and indifferent, spilling pale light across rooftops and quiet streets. In kitchens across town, radios murmured low voices between songs, coffee steamed in chipped mugs, and the smell of toast drifted through open doorways. Nothing about the air suggested that this day would fracture time, that it would split lives into a before and an after. In one small house, shoes were lined up by the door, slightly crooked from being kicked off the night before. School bags rested against the wall, stuffed with notebooks, folded homework, and the careless confidence of children who believed the world would keep its promises. A jacket lay draped over the back of a chair, one sleeve hanging lower than the other, as if reaching for someone who had already moved on. Voices echoed briefly through the hallway, casual, unremarkable. A reminder not to forget lunch. A complaint about the cold. A laugh that lasted less than a second. These sounds would later become sacred, replayed endlessly in memory. But at the time, they were just noise, background to a routine that had been lived 1,000 times before. Outside, the street was calm. A neighbor's car pulled out of the driveway. Somewhere, a dog barked once and then went quiet. The road leading toward the school curved gently, familiar enough that no one thought twice about it. Children had walked it for years. Parents watched from windows or doorways, not with fear, but with the loose attention reserved for moments that feel safe. They stepped out into the morning carrying nothing unusual, no fear, no urgency, no sense of farewell. There was no argument, no sudden intuition that something was wrong. The door closed behind them with a soft, final click, though no one understood the weight of that sound yet. Inside the house, life continued. Dishes remained in the sink, soaking in cloudy water. A chair was pushed back just enough to show someone had stood up quickly. A clock on the wall ticked forward, indifferent, marking seconds that no one would ever be able to reclaim. The quiet that followed their departure felt normal, almost comforting. The kind of silence that signals a house has done its job for the morning. This is how disappearances often begin. Not with chaos, not with violence, but with normalcy so complete it disarms suspicion. Hours later, when the sun climbed higher and shadows shifted across the living room floor, nothing inside the house had changed. Everything remained exactly as it was left. That detail would later feel unbearable. The idea that time had moved forward everywhere else, while this space remained frozen, waiting for footsteps that never returned. At school, attendance was taken. Names were called. Some answered, others didn't. Teachers made small notes, assuming late arrivals, sick days, minor disruptions. No alarms were raised. There was no announcement, no pause. Class continued. Chalk scraped across blackboards. Pages turned. Somewhere between lessons and lunch bells, the day continued to insist on its own importance. Back at home, the afternoon light crept slowly across the walls. The quiet grew heavier, though no one was there to notice. A clock chimed. A refrigerator hummed. These sounds filled the space meant for voices that would not return. By the time the school day ended, parents began to expect movement again. Doors opening, footsteps, the familiar sounds of bags hitting the floor. But the house stayed still. The silence no longer felt gentle. It began to stretch, thin and uneasy, like a held breath. At first, concern was light, almost dismissive. Maybe they stayed late. Maybe they went to a friend's house. Maybe they forgot to call. These explanations were comfortable, safe. They allowed hope to sit untouched, unchallenged. Minutes passed, then more. Outside, other children returned home, their laughter floating down the street, their presence a quiet accusation. Each passing child sharpened the absence, made it harder to ignore. Windows were checked. The road was watched. Every passing sound was mistaken for the one that would make everything normal again. It never came. As evening approached, the skies softened into deeper colors, and worry began to replace patience. Phones were lifted. Names were spoken into receivers. Questions were asked, then repeated. No one had seen them. No one remembered them arriving. No one could say when they had last been noticed. That was when the day finally broke apart. What had begun as routine transformed into disbelief. How could a normal morning lead here? How could something so ordinary end in this kind of silence? The house, once a place of return, now felt like a witness, holding on to objects, smells, and spaces that refused to explain themselves. Parents stood in rooms that still carried warmth from a morning, replaying every detail with merciless precision: the way the door closed, the time on the clock, the sound of footsteps fading down the path. Each memory sharpened into something painful, something accusing. Outside, the streetlights flickered on, illuminating pavement that had carried them away and failed to bring them back. This was the moment no one ever forgets, the instant when hope and fear occupy the same breath, when the mind refuses to accept what the heart is beginning to understand, when the ordinary becomes unrecognizable. They had left for school, and somewhere between that door and the promise of coming home, the day swallowed them whole. The morning, so quiet and unremarkable, stretched forward endlessly, refusing to end. And long before anyone realized it, that ordinary day became a fixed point in time, a memory the world would keep returning to again and again, searching for what it missed. It was the kind of place where people believed that familiarity was a form of protection. Streets curved gently instead of sharply, as if even the roads had learned to move slowly here. Houses sat close enough to recognize one another, yet far enough apart to preserve the illusion of privacy. Everyone knew which families had lived there the longest, which porches always had lights on at night, which dogs barked and which never did. Morning routines overlapped like clockwork. Parents left for work at predictable times. Storefronts unlocked their doors in the same order every day. The school bell rang and children poured inside, their footsteps echoing down hallways that smelled faintly of cleaner and old books. Nothing about the town encouraged urgency. Life unfolded in cycles that felt permanent. That belief that tomorrow would always arrive intact shaped how the town responded when the children did not come home. At first, it barely responded at all. The absence registered as an inconvenience rather than a threat. Someone mentioned it casually over a fence. Another shrugged and offered an explanation that required no alarm. Kids wander, people reminded themselves. Children forget time. The world, in this place, had always been forgiving. This was a town where neighbors assumed responsibility, without needing to be asked, where children were raised not just by parents, but by streets, sidewalks, and watchful windows. The idea that something could go wrong within such a tightly woven environment felt almost insulting, like a failure of imagination. And so the afternoon drifted on. Shops closed as usual. Cars pulled into driveways. The air cooled gently as the sun dipped lower, painting the town in soft gold. People waved to one another, exchanging pleasantries that carried no hint of concern. The day was still behaving as expected. Even when questions surfaced, they were wrapped in calm. A phone call here, a knock on a door there, no raised voices, no urgency. The underlying assumption remained untouched. This situation would resolve itself. The town had seen children come home late before. What it had not seen, what it could not yet accept, was a disappearance that did not announce itself. Authority figures shared the same confidence. Teachers recalled busy classrooms, blurred memories of faces among dozens of others. Attendance sheets showed absences, but absences happened. Nothing about it demanded escalation. The system was built on patterns, and this simply looked like a deviation that would correct itself by morning. That belief shaped everything that followed. While the families waited, the town continued to move forward, unaware that it was quietly stepping past a threshold. Dinner tables filled. Televisions flickered on. Laughter echoed from houses where the evening remained untouched by fear. The contrast was cruel, but invisible. In the homes where the children were expected to return, time behaved differently. Every sound outside felt amplified. Every passing car triggered hope. Curtains shifted. Doors opened and closed for no reason other than the need to check again. The longer the wait continued, the more fragile the explanations became, yet the town's collective calm acted like a sedative, dulling the instinct to panic. There is a strange comfort in believing that nothing truly bad can happen where you live. That comfort delayed everything. No one imagined danger, because danger had never needed to introduce itself before. The town's history was tidy, free of the kind of stories that made people lock doors or watch shadows. Crime, when it happened, was small and solvable. Misunderstandings were resolved with conversations, not investigations. This disappearance did not fit the town's narrative, and so it was quietly edited out, at least at first. By nightfall, the absence had grown harder to ignore, but the response remained cautious, restrained by habit. People did not want to overreact. Overreaction belonged to larger places, to cities where anonymity bred fear. This town believed in names, faces, and shared history. Even as worry crept in, it did so politely. Calls were made to friends' houses. Parents apologized for interrupting dinners. Each negative answer chipped away at the town's confidence, but not enough to shatter it. The assumption still lingered. They will turn up. This mindset shaped the most critical hours, the ones that would later be revisited endlessly, heavy with regret. The hours when urgency might have changed something. The hours that slipped through fingers, softened by trust. The town slept that night, uneasy but not alarmed. Lights dimmed, streets emptied. Windows reflected darkness instead of movement. Somewhere, parents lay awake, listening for sounds that never came, while neighbors dreamed ordinary dreams, unaware that the town's sense of safety was already eroding. By morning, whispers began to replace reassurances. Questions spread faster than answers. How could no one have seen them? How could they have vanished without a trace in a place where everyone watched everyone else? The same familiarity that once felt protective now felt suffocating, as if the town itself was closing around a mystery it could not explain. But still denial held on. The idea that something truly wrong had happened required a kind of emotional permission the town was slow to grant. To accept danger would mean admitting that all the quiet rules people live by, the trust, the routines, the belief in safety, were fragile. And so the town lingered in a space between concern and fear, suspended by habit. This was not negligence born of indifference. It was something more unsettling. It was confidence turned inward, a belief system that had never been tested until now. The town assumed tomorrow would arrive with answers because tomorrow always had before. What no one realized was that this disappearance was not waiting to be solved by time. Time was already working against them. By the time urgency finally took root, the town would look back on this day with disbelief, replaying every calm decision, every delayed reaction, every moment when the danger had been invisible because no one believed it could exist here. The town had assumed tomorrow, and in doing so, it allowed the present to slip quietly out of reach. It did not arrive with a single phone call or a dramatic realization. Instead, it crept in quietly, threading itself through conversations and pauses, settling into the spaces between words. At first, it felt like impatience, then confusion, and finally, something heavier, an unnamed weight that pressed down on every thought. As night deepened, the town's earlier confidence began to unravel. Streetlights cast long, distorted shadows across sidewalks that had once felt welcoming. Doors opened more frequently now, not to greet returning children, but to scan the dark. Each passing minute stretched further than the last, turning time into something thick and uncooperative. Parents stood at windows long after they should have gone to bed, eyes fixed on the road, as if willpower alone could bend the night into returning what it had taken. Every sound sparked hope. Footsteps that turned out to be wind, distant voices that belonged to someone else, headlights that passed without slowing. Phone calls multiplied. Names were repeated so often they began to lose their shape. Friends were contacted again, just in case memory had shifted, just in case someone had forgotten a detail that now felt critical. With every unanswered question, fear gained a little more ground. At the school, administrators returned to attendance logs, scanning lines of ink that suddenly seemed insufficient. Teachers replayed the day in their minds, searching for faces that had blended into the routine of the classroom. Nothing stood out. That absence of memory felt worse than a bad one. By the time authorities were contacted, the tone had changed. This was no longer a situation that could be resolved by patience. The word missing entered the conversation, tentative at first, as though saying it too loudly might make it real. Officers asked questions that forced the families to confront what they had been avoiding. What were they wearing? What route did they take? When were they last seen? Each question tightened the knot. Descriptions were offered through trembling voices. Every detail suddenly precious. Clothing colors, shoe styles, backpack straps. These ordinary things took on unbearable importance, transformed into lifelines. Parents clung to the hope that somewhere someone had noticed something. Outside, the town began to change. Cars slowed as they passed. Neighbors gathered in small clusters, speaking in low voices. The familiar streets took on an unfamiliar edge, as if they were revealing a second identity after dark. The sense of shared safety fractured, replaced by something brittle and watchful. Searches began cautiously, then with growing urgency. Flashlights cut through the darkness, sweeping across yards, fields, and the edges of woods that bordered the town. Names were called into the night, carried by voices that wavered between hope and dread. The darkness absorbed every sound without answering. Each passing hour deepened the fear that time itself was now the enemy. There is a particular kind of terror that comes from not knowing. It feeds on imagination, filling the absence of information with endless possibilities. As the night stretched on, parents began to confront thoughts they had never allowed themselves before. Accidents, strangers, places unseen. Sleep became impossible. Inside their homes, familiar rooms felt altered, as if the missing presence had changed their shape. Beds remained untouched. Lights stayed on in hallways long past midnight. Every object became a reminder of what was not there. The town's early restraint gave way to collective unease. People who had once assumed everything would resolve itself now moved with purpose, driven by the shared understanding that something was deeply wrong. But even as fear took hold, it lacked direction. No clear leads, no witnesses, no answers. The absence of evidence was its own kind of evidence, and it terrified everyone. As dawn approached, exhaustion settled in, heavy and disorienting. Faces were drawn, eyes red from lack of sleep. The sky lightened slowly, revealing a town that looked unchanged but felt irrevocably altered. Morning arrived without relief. The realization was now unavoidable. The children had not simply wandered off. They had not missed a bus or stayed late without telling anyone. Something had interrupted the ordinary flow of the day, and no one knew what. That understanding hit with devastating force. Parents were asked again to retrace every step of the morning, every conversation, every glance exchanged before the door closed. Guilt began to surface, quiet but relentless. Should they have walked them to school? Should they have noticed something, anything out of place? These questions had no answers, but they would linger for years. The search expanded with daylight. More volunteers joined. Maps were drawn. Areas were assigned. People who had never spoken more than a greeting now stood side by side, united by a fear that felt too large for the town to hold. Yet even as effort increased, clarity did not. The absence of clues created a vacuum that swallowed certainty. Every possibility felt equally likely and equally horrifying. Without something to anchor their fear, the town drifted into a state of suspended panic, waiting for a sign that refused to appear. This was a turning point, the moment when waiting transformed into fear, when hope became fragile and conditional, the moment when the town collectively understood that the ordinary explanations had run out. The night had passed. The children were still gone. And with that realization came a truth no one was prepared to face. Whatever had happened was no longer contained within a single day. It was becoming something larger, something that would stretch far beyond the present moment. The town would never wait the same way again. The sun rose over a town already awake, already exhausted, already bracing itself for what it might uncover. Faces gathered at intersections and on front lawns, drawn together by a shared purpose that felt both urgent and uncertain. The fear that had settled in overnight did not fade with daylight. It sharpened, becoming more focused, more demanding. Search efforts grew quickly, fueled by a belief that if enough eyes scanned the same ground, the children would have to appear. Volunteers arrived in coats and boots, some carrying thermoses, others gripping flashlights they no longer needed but refused to put down. People who had never set foot beyond the edges of town now found themselves walking through fields, along creeks, and into wooded areas they had only ever driven past. The landscape felt unfamiliar, stripped of its usual innocence. Authorities organized teams, drawing lines on maps that divided the town and its surroundings into sections. Instructions were given carefully, respectfully. No one wanted to sound alarmist, but no one wanted to waste time either. The air buzzed with movement, radios crackling, voices calling out instructions that blended into the hum of collective effort. Names were called again and again. Each shout carried a mixture of hope and dread, echoing across open land and disappearing into trees that offered no response. Every rustle of leaves, every shadow between branches, sparked a momentary surge of anticipation. Then nothing. The searches moved methodically, almost reverently. People scanned the ground for signs, footprints, dropped belongings, anything that might suggest a direction, a story, a moment where something had gone wrong. Each time a piece of trash or a broken branch was discovered, hearts raced, only to sink when it led nowhere. The absence of evidence became impossible to ignore. Dogs were brought in, trained to find what human eyes might miss. They moved with confidence, noses low to the ground, handlers watching for any change in behavior. For brief moments, hope flared as leashes tightened and dogs pulled forward, only to stall confused as sense faded into nothing. Every dead end felt personal. As hours passed, fatigue set in. Boots grew heavy with mud. Voices grew hoarse from calling out. Yet no one wanted to stop. To rest felt like betrayal, as if pausing might allow something irreversible to happen. People pushed through exhaustion, driven by a shared determination that bordered on desperation. Families waited on the edges of the search zones, watching strangers comb through spaces that suddenly felt intimate. Their gratitude was profound, but so was their helplessness. They were surrounded by effort, yet starved for answers. The town, once so certain of itself, now leaned heavily on the idea that action alone could fix what had gone wrong. But the truth remained elusive. As the search widened, it began to touch everything except the one thing it needed most. Roads were checked. Abandoned buildings were examined. Ditches and culverts were inspected with care. Each location cleared felt like progress and failure at the same time. With every hour that passed, the question grew louder. How could so many people search so thoroughly and find nothing at all? Speculation began to creep in, quiet at first, then more openly. Maybe they had been picked up by someone. Maybe they had gone somewhere no one thought to look. Each theory clashed with the evidence, or lack of it, leaving behind only uncertainty. The landscape itself seemed to resist explanation. Familiar places took on new meaning. A stretch of road once considered harmless now felt exposed. A line of trees that had provided shade now appeared concealing. The town was being forced to see itself differently, through the lens of what might be hidden rather than what was known. As night approached again, the search did not stop. Lights were strung. Flashlights were replaced with stronger beams. The darkness felt heavier than the night before, weighed down by disappointment and fear. The calls into the dark sounded different now, less hopeful, more pleading. Still, nothing answered. Each hour that passed without discovery carved the possibility that the truth was slipping further away. People began to realize that searching was not the same as understanding. They were touching every surface, yet somehow missing something essential. This realization was deeply unsettling. By the time search effort slowed, not because of success but because of exhaustion, the town was changed. The belief that proximity guaranteed safety had been shaken. The idea that a collective effort could always uncover the truth felt suddenly fragile. What remained was a haunting contradiction. The more thoroughly the town searched, the more certain it became that something crucial had been overlooked. The children had not vanished into thin air, yet the ground beneath everyone's feet refused to tell their story. As volunteers dispersed, promising to return at first light, the streets fell quiet again. But this silence was different from the one that had followed the ordinary morning days before. It was heavy with knowledge. Knowledge that effort alone was not enough, and that the truth might be far closer and far more concealed than anyone wanted to believe. The search had touched everything, except the truth. It happened gradually, almost instinctively. Without evidence to follow, attention shifted from places to people. Conversations changed tone. The same neighbors who had stood shoulder to shoulder in fields and forests now studied one another more closely, measuring words, remembering past moments with new suspicion. In the absence of facts, imagination rushed to fill the space. Someone remembered seeing a car parked oddly that morning. Someone else recalled a man who didn't belong, though they couldn't quite explain why. Small details, once meaningless, were elevated into possible clues. Each retelling sharpened them, gave them weight they may never have deserved. The town's familiarity, once its greatest comfort, now became a source of unease. People replayed interactions in their minds, wondering what they had missed. A neighbor who kept to himself, a routine that seemed slightly off, a conversation that ended too abruptly. The human mind, desperate for explanation, began stitching together narratives from fragments and coincidence. None of it felt solid. All of it felt dangerous. Rumors spread quietly at first, passed in lowered voices at kitchen tables, and over phone calls that lasted too long. No one wanted to accuse anyone openly, but suspicion seeped into everyday interactions. Smiles grew tighter, greetings shorter. The town's easy rhythm fractured into something tense and watchful. Families of the missing felt this shift acutely. They were pulled into conversations that offered sympathy layered with implication. Questions came disguised as concern, but carried a different weight. Had there been problems at home? Any reason they might have run away? These suggestions landed heavily, placing responsibility where none belonged. Grief mixed with defensiveness. Fear mixed with anger. The lack of clear direction from authorities only intensified the atmosphere. Investigators followed leads that dissolved under scrutiny, knocking on doors, asking the same questions again and again. Each visit left behind unease, reminding everyone that no one was entirely outside the scope of suspicion. The town had entered a phase where certainty no longer mattered as much as possibility. Strangers became easy targets. Anyone passing through drew attention. A parked vehicle lingered too long, and heads turned. A newcomer's presence sparked whispers. The town, once open and trusting, began to close ranks, guarding itself against imagined threats. Yet suspicion did not stop at the unfamiliar. Long-standing relationships strained under the pressure. People remembered old arguments, forgotten grudges, moments that now felt darker in retrospect. The past was reinterpreted to the lens of the present, reshaped to fit a mystery that demanded a culprit. This was the most corrosive stage of the disappearance, not because it brought danger closer, but because it eroded the very fabric of the community. Children were kept closer. Doors were locked more often. Trust, once assumed, now had to be earned. The town learned what it meant to live with unanswered questions, how uncertainty could seep into everything, altering behavior in subtle but permanent ways. For the families at the center of the loss, this period was especially isolating. They found themselves trapped between hope and accusation, mourning and defending. Every theory felt like a judgment. Every rumor reopened wounds. They longed for facts, not because facts would erase pain, but because they would end this endless speculation. But facts remained elusive. As weeks passed, the initial urgency faded, replaced by a slower, more corrosive tension. The case did not disappear, but it lost its sharp edges, becoming something people spoke about cautiously, aware of the emotional weight it carried. The town learned to live with a mystery, even as it quietly reshaped daily life. Public spaces felt different. The school hallways carried an undercurrent of absence. Teachers paused when calling roll, haunted by names that would never be answered again. Classrooms adjusted, desks reassigned, routines altered, but the gap remained. Everywhere, there was a sense of incompletion. Speculation continued, cycling through theories without resolution. Some believed the children had been taken far away, removed from the town entirely. Others insisted the truth lay much closer, hidden in plain sight. Each belief offered a kind of comfort, a narrative that made the uncertainty bearable. None of them brought peace. As time stretched on, suspicion hardened into quiet divisions. Certain houses became subjects of whispered conversations. Certain families felt watched, judged without evidence. The town's shared grief splintered, no longer uniting people but pulling them apart. What no one realized was that this phase, this restless searching for someone to blame, was as much a part of the mystery as the disappearance itself. The truth did not need to hide in shadows when it could be buried beneath assumptions. The town had searched fields and forests. It had scoured roads and buildings. Now it searched its own reflection, looking for answers in faces it thought it knew. And still, the mystery remained without a shape. The absence endured, unchallenged by facts, sustained by rumor and fear. Each passing day deepened the sense that something fundamental had been lost, not just children, but certainty itself. The town had entered a new reality, one where questions lingered longer than answers, and suspicion became a substitute for truth. And somewhere within that tangled web of doubt and assumption, the Rayall story waited, unseen, untouched, and quietly patient. Days folded into weeks, weeks into months, until the case stopped feeling like an emergency and started feeling like a presence, something that lingered quietly in the background of daily life. The town learned how to carry the absence without knowing where to place it. There were fewer meetings, fewer phone calls, fewer searches that promised anything new. The urgency did not vanish. It simply learned how to live alongside routine. Posters faded first. They curled the edges, their colors washed out by sun and rain. Faces that once demanded attention began to blend into walls and notice boards, becoming part of the scenery. People still notice them, but differently now, with a quick glance instead of a pause. Each time someone walked past without stopping, the distance between memory and action grew a little wider. Investigators continued their work, but the tone shifted. Leads became rarer, thinner. Tips arrived late at night or years too late, built on secondhand memories and regret. Files thickened with paperwork, but not with answers. Every possibility had been explored, revisited, then set aside. The case did not close. It simply stopped moving. Families aged in place with their grief. Birthdays passed quietly, acknowledged in private rather than celebrated. Empty chairs at tables became permanent. Bedrooms were kept the same for longer than anyone admitted was healthy, as if preserving space could preserve possibility. Objects gathered dust without losing meaning. A jacket still smelled faintly like the person who once wore it. A notebook remained untouched, its last page unfinished. Hope changed shape. At first, it had been loud and demanding, insisting on searches and answers. Now it became something quieter, more fragile. Families learned to live with a conditional kind of hope, the kind that survived without expectation. They stopped waiting for phone calls, but they never stopped listening. The town, too, adapted. New families moved in, unaware of the full weight of the story. Children grew up hearing fragments of it, told in lowered voices or as cautionary tales. The disappearance became part of the town's identity, referenced without detail, remembered without clarity. It was something that had happened, not something that was happening. This shift was perhaps the most painful of all. When a mystery becomes history, it loses urgency but not consequence. The questions remain unanswered, but fewer people feel compelled to ask them. The disappearance became something people carried rather than confronted. Years passed. Investigators retired. New ones inherited files heavy with documentation, but light on direction. Fresh eyes scanned old photographs, reread statements, and traced timelines that had already been traced dozens of times before. Each review ended the same way. Too many gaps, not enough certainty. The absence of evidence continued to be the case's defining feature. Every few years, something would stir interest again, a new tip, a re-examination, a documentary mention. Hope would flicker, brief and cautious. Families learned not to lean too hard into these moments. They had learned the cost of hope raised too high. The town marked time through changes that felt unrelated but were quietly connected. Buildings were renovated. Roads were widened. Old landmarks disappeared, replaced by new ones that held no memory of what happened. Each change erased a small piece of the landscape that had once been searched so thoroughly. The physical world moved on, indifferent to what it concealed. Memory became the only fixed point. For those who lived through the disappearance, certain dates never lost their weight. The morning it began, the night it became real. These moments existed outside of calendars, resurfacing each year without warning. Grief did not diminish. It learned how to coexist with living. There was no closure, only endurance. The case slipped further into the margins of attention, resurfacing occasionally in conversation or local lore. It became one of those stories people reference vaguely, with phrases like, "remember when," or "that time years ago." The details blurred, but the unease remained. For the families, time offered no relief, only distance from the moment everything changed. They watched the world continue in ways their children never could. Graduations, marriages, careers, lives unfolding elsewhere while theirs remained suspended. Each milestone reached by others was a reminder of what had been stolen. This was not a disappearance that faded. It settled. It embedded itself into routines, into silences, into the way people spoke carefully about the past. The lack of resolution did not mean the story ended. It meant the story learned how to survive without an ending. Decades later, the town would still feel it. Not as sharply, not as loudly, but persistently. In the way people locked doors without knowing why. In the way parents watched their children walk away just a little longer than necessary. In the way trust was offered with subtle hesitation. The disappearance had reshaped the town's understanding of safety, permanence, and certainty. And yet, despite the years, despite the fading posters and retired investigators, something about the case refused to disappear completely. It lingered like an unanswered question, patient and unresolved. The truth had not been lost to time. It had been waiting within it. It sat quietly among others like it, unremarkable in shape and color, its presence so consistent that it eventually became invisible. People passed it without thinking, the way they did with familiar trees or street signs. It never demanded attention. It never seemed connected to anything that mattered. In the early days of the disappearance, its name surfaced briefly, almost out of obligation. It was close enough to the route. Someone mentioned it in passing. Someone else dismissed it just as quickly. There was no reason to linger. No noise, no reports, no obvious link. And so it slipped through the cracks, not because it was cleared, but because it was never truly questioned. Time reinforced that dismissal. As years passed, the house aged in place. Paint faded. Small repairs were made, then not made. Occupants came and went, each leaving behind subtle changes that blended into the structure rather than redefining it. To newcomers, it was just another old house. To long-time residents, it was part of the background, stripped of any emotional weight. But memory has a way of circling back. Decades after the disappearance, when the case resurfaced in fragments, through anniversaries, archival reviews, quiet investigative curiosity, the house re-entered the conversation. Not loudly, not dramatically, just as a question that had never been answered properly. Why had it been overlooked? The files offered no clear explanation, no thorough search, no detailed notes, just a line or two acknowledging its existence and moving on. It was not listed among the places combed by volunteers or examined by authorities. It existed in the margins of the investigation, mentioned but never explored. This absence of attention began to feel unsettling. Investigators who revisited the case noticed patterns that had been invisible before. Routes walked, timelines reconstructed, sightlines reconsidered. And there was again present, proximate, and silent, not suspicious in the traditional sense, but unresolved. The house did not stand out because of what it was. It stood out because of what had been allowed to remain. There is something deeply disturbing about places that escape scrutiny not because they're hidden, but because they are too familiar to be questioned. Familiarity dulls instinct. It replaces curiosity with assumption. The house benefited from this blindness. People had assumed they knew it. When inquiries began again, reactions were mixed. Some residents were surprised the house was being mentioned at all. Others felt a quiet discomfort they couldn't fully explain. A few recalled vague memories. Nothing concrete, just impressions that had never settled into concern. A light on late at night. A door that always seemed closed. A sense that it existed slightly apart from the rhythm of the street. None of these details had felt important at the time. They felt different now. The renewed attention did not come with accusations. It came with hesitation. Investigators moved carefully, aware of how many years had passed, how many lives had unfolded since the disappearance. The goal was not to assign blame, but to fill in gaps left behind by urgency, exhaustion, and misplaced trust. The house had been spared by time, but time had not absolved it. When permission was finally granted to examine the property more closely, the process was almost anticlimactic. No dramatic confrontations. No immediate discoveries. just a slow, methodical approach that contrasted sharply with the chaos of the early search years. The exterior revealed nothing unusual. The interior appeared ordinary, shaped by decades of use and neglect. Rooms told stories of habitation, not secrecy. Furniture bore the marks of age. Walls held layers of paint, each one covering another era. And yet, there was a feeling, subtle but persistent, that the space held more than it showed. Investigators and inspectors noticed inconsistencies, slight irregularities in measurements, a wall that seemed thicker than necessary, a layout that didn't quite match the original plans. These details were small, easy to dismiss, but together they suggested something unfinished, something altered. The house had been modified, not recently, not dramatically, but deliberately. Records showed renovations done long ago, some undocumented, others vaguely described. Nothing overtly alarming, nothing illegal on its surface, but enough to raise questions that had never been asked before. Why change this part of the house? Why seal off that space? These were not questions that would have mattered in the first frantic days of the disappearance. Back then, urgency demanded speed, not nuance. But decades later, nuance was all that remained. The house began to feel less like a structure and more like a pause, a place where something had been interrupted and then concealed. People who had lived nearby for years struggled to reconcile this new scrutiny with their memories. The idea that something significant could have existed so close, untouched, felt deeply unsettling. It forced the town to confront a painful possibility, that the truth might not have been lost to distance or time, but to assumption. The house had not hidden itself. It had been hidden by belief. As interest grew, so did discomfort. The house became a topic of quiet conversation. Its windows watched more closely than before. It was no longer invisible. It was a reminder of how easily certainty can be misplaced. The realization settled slowly but firmly. This place had always been part of the story. It just hadn't been treated as such. And now, after half a century of silence, the house stood at the center of a question that refused to fade. What else had been overlooked? Simply because it seemed too ordinary to matter? The walls, unchanged for decades, offered no answers yet. But they had begun to speak in another way. Through their inconsistencies, their omissions, their quiet resistance to being fully understood. The town had spent years searching outward. Only now was it beginning to understand that the truth might have been waiting inside something it thought it already knew. The discovery did not happen all at once. It unfolded in fragments, the way truths often do when they've been buried for too long. It began with renovation work. Ordinary, practical, motivated by age rather than curiosity. The house had reached a point where repairs were no longer optional. Floors sagged. Wiring needed replacement. Walls were open not to uncover secrets, but to keep the structure standing. Dust filled the air, thick and ancient, carrying the smell of old wood and forgotten time. Layers of paint and plaster were peeled back carefully, revealing the history of the house in muted colors and textures. Nothing about the work felt dramatic. It was methodical, unremarkable, routine, until it wasn't. Behind one wall, the measurements did not add up. What should have been empty space, or simply the continuation of another room, ended abruptly. The cavity was too deep, too deliberate. It wasn't a flaw in construction. It was a choice. Someone had decided that this space should not exist. At first, there was hesitation. The workers paused, tools hanging loosely in their hands, unsure whether to proceed. Houses settle, people told themselves. Old buildings hide quirks. Not every anomaly means something. But the longer they stood there, the more the silence pressed in. The wall was thicker than it needed to be. When it finally gave way, the sound was dull, muted, as if the house itself resisted being opened. Plaster cracked, wood splintered, and a narrow opening appeared, just enough to suggest depth beyond it. Air rushed out, stale and cold, carrying a smell that had no clear description. It was not decay exactly, but something closed off, preserved in stillness. The kind of air that had not moved in decades. Light was angled into the opening, thin and cautious. What it revealed was not a room in the conventional sense. There were no windows, no natural light, just a contained space, sealed intentionally, its edges sharp and purposeful. This was not an accident of architecture. This was a decision. The realization settled heavily. People gathered, drawn by the weight of what had been found. Conversations dropped into whispers. No one wanted to say too much too quickly, as if naming the discovery might give it power. The space was small, but not insignificant, large enough to occupy, large enough to hold presence. Its walls were bare, marked only by age and the quiet erosion of time. Dust lay thick on the floor, undisturbed, forming a soft, deceptive layer that hid what lay beneath. The room did not announce its purpose. It did not offer immediate answers. There were no dramatic symbols, no clear indicators of what had happened there. Instead, it offered implication, subtle, chilling, and deeply unsettling. This was a place meant to be unseen. As authorities were notified and the house secured, the town's long-dormant anxieties stirred awake. News traveled quickly, but not loudly. People spoke in careful tones, choosing words that avoided conclusions while hinting at fear. The discovery did not confirm anything, but it shattered the idea that nothing had been missed. Inside the hidden space, investigators moved slowly. Every inch mattered now, every particle of dust, every mark on the walls. The room was examined not just for what it contained, but for what it lacked. No decoration, no personal touches, no signs of comfort. It was utilitarian, stripped of humanity, and that absence spoke volumes. Objects, when they were found, were few and nondescript, fragments rather than artifacts, pieces that suggested activity, without explaining it, items that could belong to anyone or no one. Their significance lay not in what they were, but in where they had been placed. The room did not tell a story. It resisted narrative, and that resistance was its most disturbing feature. The walls, once sealed, had done their job too well. They had kept sound in. They had kept light out. They had preserved whatever truth existed inside them without revealing it. Time had passed, but the room had remained unchanged, waiting for what? No one could say. As investigators documented the space, the weight of decades pressed down on everyone involved. This was not a discovery that belonged to the present alone. It was tethered to the past, to a day that had never truly ended for town. The idea that this room had existed during the disappearance and had gone unnoticed was almost unbearable. Questions multiplied faster than answers. Who built it? When? Why was it sealed so thoroughly? And perhaps most haunting of all, how many people had lived in that house, passed through its rooms, unaware of what lay hidden behind its walls? The town struggled to reconcile the ordinariness of the house with the implications of the room. It challenged a deeply held belief that danger announces itself, that wrongness feels obvious. This discovery suggested something far more unsettling, that horror can coexist quietly with routine, hidden by normalcy. For the families, the revelation was both devastating and clarifying. After decades of uncertainty, the existence of the room offered a focal point for grief that had never known where to land. It did not provide closure. It did not answer the question of what happened, but it confirmed that the truth had not been abstract or distant. It had been physical, contained, real. That knowledge cut deeply. The room became a symbol of everything that had been missed, not just by investigators, but by the town itself. It represented the cost of assumption, of believing that what feels familiar must be safe, that what appears ordinary cannot conceal something terrible. As the investigation continued, the room was emptied carefully, each movement deliberate, respectful. There was an understanding that this space was not just evidence. It was a fragment of lived experience, even if that experience could never be fully known. Outside the house, people gathered quietly. Some watched from a distance, unwilling to get too close. Others lingered longer than necessary, drawn by a need to see, to understand, to bear witness. The street, once unremarkable, felt charged with history, as if the ground itself remembered something it had never revealed. The hidden room did not solve the mystery, but it changed it. It shifted the narrative from absence to concealment, from loss to deliberate erasure. It forced the town to confront the possibility that the disappearance had not been a question of where the children went, but where they had been kept unseen. And perhaps most haunting of all, It raised the realization that the truth had not been lost to time. It had been sealed behind a wall, waiting patiently for someone to notice what did not quite belong. The room, once hidden, now stood open to the light, its silence heavier than any answer. After the discovery, the town expected movement, answers, statements, conclusions that would finally allow everyone to breathe differently. Instead, what followed was a long, quiet pause. The hidden room existed now in reality, undeniable and heavy, but it did not immediately give back what had been lost. It only deepened the absence by reminding everyone of its permanence. And so attention drifted, not outward toward solutions, but inward toward reflection. People began to speak less about what happened and more about what might have been. The children, once frozen in memory as they were on the day they disappeared, began to age in imagination. Parents, siblings, and even townspeople who had known them only in passing found themselves picturing futures that had never been lived. Faces that had once smiled from faded posters now wore expressions shaped by adulthood, care lines around eyes, confidence replacing uncertainty, voices deeper, postures steadier. These imagined versions felt painfully vivid. Someone wondered what kind of work they might have chosen, whether they would have stayed in town or left, drawn towards something larger, whether they would have loved loudly or cautiously, whether they would have had children of their own, unknowingly continuing a lineage that had been cut short before it could fully begin. These thoughts did not bring comfort, but they brought proximity. For decades, grief had been abstract, an unanswered question lingering in the background of life. Now it became personal again, grounded not in mystery, but in the reality that entire lives had been erased, not just moments. Families revisited memories with a new kind of tenderness. Small details that once caused pain now carried a fragile warmth. The way one of them used to hum without realizing it. The habit of leaving drawers half open. The stubbornness. The curiosity. The unfinished dreams spoken aloud in childhood confidence. These recollections were no longer tied solely to loss, but to identity. They had been someone, not just missing, not just victims. The town began to understand that what had been taken was not only presence, but possibility. Anniversaries took on new weight. Dates that had once passed quietly now demanded acknowledgement. People found themselves marking time differently, measuring years not by events that happened, but by lives that should have unfolded alongside them. Graduations came and went, each one a quiet reminder. Weddings filled churches and halls, and in the back of some minds lingered the thought of who should have been standing there too. Children were born, named, raised, each milestone a mirror reflecting what had been denied. Grief, once suspended, now had somewhere to land. But landing did not mean resolution. The imagined futures were not fantasies meant to soothe. They were exercises in mourning the full scope of loss. To imagine adulthood was to confront the enormity of what had been stolen. These were not just children who never came home. They were adults who never arrived. Some parents spoke of dreams where time corrected itself. In these dreams, the door finally opened. Footsteps returned. Voices filled the house again, older but familiar. The dream always ended the same way, awakening into a silence that felt sharper than before. Yet even these dreams were cherished because they allowed for a moment the experience of continuation. Others avoided imagining altogether. To picture who they might have become felt like betrayal, as if accepting the impossibility of their return. Holding on to the image of childhood felt safer, frozen and intact. Time, in memory, could not touch them there. Both responses were forms of love. The discovery of the hidden room forced the town to confront a painful truth. Closure does not always arrive as an answer. Sometimes it arrives as an understanding of scale, of how much was lost, how deeply it echoes, and how little can ever be recovered. There were conversations that had never happened before. Siblings, now grown, spoke openly about growing up in the shadow of absence, about the guilt of surviving, about the strange responsibility of carrying memory alone. They spoke of moments when joy felt forbidden, when laughter carried an aftertaste of apology. They also spoke of resilience, not the kind that erases pain, but the kind that allows life to continue alongside it. The town listened differently now. For years, the disappearance had been treated as a mystery to be solved. Now it was understood as a wound that had shaped generations. People recognized behaviors they had never questioned before: the overprotectiveness, the quiet caution, the way children were watched just a little longer before letting go. These were not coincidences. They were legacies. The hidden room did not just belong to the house. It belonged to the town's collective psyche, a representation of everything unspoken, everything sealed away because it was too painful to confront. By imagining the lives that might have continued, people began to reclaim something that had been denied to them: the ability to mourn fully. This mourning was not dramatic. It did not demand public displays or declarations. It unfolded in private moments, in cars parked too long in driveways, in hands resting on old photographs, in pauses during conversation when a thought drifted somewhere unreachable. There was no timeline for this kind of grief. It moved unpredictably, resurfacing when least expected. A song on the radio, a familiar laugh heard in a crowd, a child walking the same route, unaware of the history beneath their feet. Each moment carried the potential to reopen something that had never truly closed. And yet, something shifted. The town no longer spoke of the disappearance solely in terms of fear or suspicion. It spoke in terms of absence and humanity. The narrative softened, not because the truth was less important, but because the people mattered more. The children were remembered not for how they vanished, but for who they were. This shift did not erase the need for answers. It reframed it. The question was no longer just what happened, but what had been lost, and how to honor it without resolution. Some families created private rituals, small acts of remembrance that did not seek attention. A candle lit on certain nights, a letter written and never sent, a walk taken along familiar paths, retracing steps not to search, but to remember. Others chose to speak publicly, not to reopen wounds, but to prevent forgetting. They spoke about the importance of looking closely at the familiar, of questioning assumptions, of understanding that safety is not guaranteed by routine. These messages were not born of anger. They were born of experience. The imagined futures continued to evolve. As years passed, those who had once been children in the town now reached ages the missing never had. They crossed milestones that felt oddly weighted, as if accompanied by invisible companions. Some spoke quietly of this feeling, that they were living not just for themselves, but for someone else too. This was not survivor's guilt alone. It was continuity. The absence had not erased connection. It had transformed it. The hidden room remained a focal point of investigation, but emotionally, the town had begun to look beyond it, not away from it, but through it, seeing it as part of a larger story about how easily lives can be interrupted, how silently futures can be taken. The room was a reminder of concealment. The imagined lives were reminders of possibility. Together, they formed a complete picture, not of resolution, but of meaning. The town understood now that even if every fact were uncovered, something would remain unfinished. The lives that might have continued could never be restored. But acknowledging them, naming them, imagining them, honoring them, was a way of resisting erasure. The disappearance had taken much, but it had not taken memory. And in that memory, the children continued, not as mysteries frozen in time, but as lives imagined forward, carried gently by those who refused to let them end where they were taken. Developer mode. The reopening of the case did not arrive with celebration. It arrived with restraint. There were no promises made to the families, no assurances that answers were finally within reach. Authorities spoke carefully, choosing words that acknowledged significance without offering comfort. The discovery of the hidden room had changed the landscape of the investigation, but it had not simplified it. If anything, it had complicated everything. Files were reopened, their pages brittle with age. Statements were reread, timelines reconstructed once again, this time with a different gravity. Events that had once seemed unrelated were placed side by side, compared not for what they proved, but for what they failed to explain. The investigation moved forward, but slowly, as if aware that haste had already cost too much. Evidence was examined with modern tools, techniques unavailable decades earlier. Dust, fibers, traces once invisible were now scrutinized for meaning. Every fragment was treated, as if it might be the one that tipped the balance. But science, for all its precision, could not restore what time had softened. The truth began to take shape, but it was not clean. There were conclusions that could be suggested, probabilities that could be argued. Certain scenarios became more plausible than others, but certainty remained elusive. Too much had passed. Too many moments had gone unrecorded. The room answered the question of how something could be hidden, but not fully why, nor by whom, nor for how long. For the families, this partial clarity was its own kind of burden. They were confronted with a reality that hovered just short of resolution. Enough information to suggest intention, concealment, wrongdoing, but not enough to complete the story. It was a truth without finality, a revelation that illuminated the outline of loss without filling it in. Some found this unbearable. They had waited decades for answers, only to be offered implications. The mind longs for certainty, especially after long periods of doubt, to know that something happened, but not exactly how or why. Reopened wounds that had barely scarred over. Hope returned, but it did not feel kind. It felt sharp, edged with disappointment. Others accepted this new truth quietly. They understood that answers do not always arrive whole, that sometimes the most honest conclusion is an incomplete one. For them, knowing that the disappearance had not been imagined, minimized, or forgotten was enough. The room existed. The concealment was real. The loss had a physical dimension that could no longer be denied. This understanding did not bring peace, but it brought validation. The town struggled with this complexity. For years, people had framed the disappearance as a mystery waiting to be solved. Now it was clear that solving it would not restore balance. The truth, when it surfaced, did not soothe, it unsettled. Public discussions grew cautious. Officials avoided definitive statements. Media attention surged briefly, then pulled back, respectful of the ambiguity. This was not a story that could be wrapped in conclusions or timelines. It resisted closure. The hidden room became both a focal point and a limit. It proved that something had been concealed deliberately, but it did not reveal the full chain of responsibility. It invited questions without promising answers. The town had to learn how to live with that tension. For the families, grief took on a new texture. They were no longer haunted solely by not knowing. They were now confronted with knowing just enough to understand the depth of what had been taken, without the relief of justice or finality. It was a cruel balance, truth without comfort. Some families expressed anger openly, not just at those who might have been responsible, but at the systems that had failed to look closely enough when it mattered most, at the assumptions that delayed scrutiny, at the belief that familiarity equaled safety. This anger was not explosive. It was steady, informed by years of restraint. Others turned inward. They spoke less, choosing private reflection over public discussion. They carried the truth quietly, integrating it into lives that had already been shaped by absence. For them, reopening the case was not about outcomes, but about acknowledgement, about refusing to let silence be the final word. The town listened, but it did not know how to respond. There were no ceremonies that felt appropriate, no gestures that could balance the weight of decades. The discovery had reopened an emotional ledger that could never be fully settled. Everyone felt the imbalance, even if they could not articulate it. The investigation eventually slowed again, not because interest faded, but because limits were reached. Evidence led only so far. Possibilities narrowed, but did not collapse into certainty. The case remained open in name, but unresolved in practice. This was not failure. It was reality. The truth, when it finally arrived, did not arrive as a gift. It arrived as a reminder that understanding does not always heal, that clarity can coexist with pain, that answers do not erase absence. The town learned this lesson slowly. People adjusted their expectations, not lowering them, but reshaping them. Justice, they realized, is not always an event. Sometimes it is recognition. Sometimes it is remembrance. Sometimes it is a refusal to let a story end in silence. The hidden room no longer symbolized hope alone. It symbolized accountability, not fully realized, but acknowledged. It stood as evidence that what had happened was real, deliberate, and wrong. That mattered. It mattered because it shifted blame away from uncertainty and placed it where it belonged, on actions taken, choices made, spaces sealed. Even without a final verdict, the narrative changed. The disappearance was no longer an abstract tragedy. It was a consequence. This understanding did not absolve anyone. It complicated everything. Families continued to live with unanswered questions, but they did so knowing that the truth had been closer than anyone imagined. That knowledge was painful, but it was also grounding. It replaced endless speculation with something tangible, even if incomplete. The town carried this truth forward, not loudly, not triumphantly, but with a quiet seriousness that reflected its weight. Conversations about safety, vigilance, and assumption took on new meaning. People spoke less about fear and more about awareness. The story had changed. It no longer asked only where the children went. It asked how easily they were allowed to disappear, how trust had obscured scrutiny, how time had protected concealment. These were uncomfortable questions, but they were necessary. The truth, stripped of comfort, demanded to be held honestly. It did not offer resolution. It offered responsibility. To remember accurately, to speak carefully, to look more closely at the familiar. In the end, the reopening of the case did not close a chapter. It revealed that the chapter had never truly ended, and that the truth, however incomplete, would always matter more than the illusion of peace. Long after the investigation quieted again, after the officials stepped back and the attention faded, the story remained, settled into the town like a low, constant hum that never fully disappeared. It lived in the pauses, in the way conversations sometimes stopped mid-sentence, as if everyone involved sensed an invisible boundary, in the way people chose their words more carefully when talking about the past, in the way silence itself carried meaning, heavy and deliberate. The town did not return to what it had been before. It learned instead how to exist alongside what it could not undo. New generations grew up hearing fragments of story, never the full weight of it at first. Parents told it softly, as a warning disguised as concern. Teachers mentioned it cautiously, more as history than tragedy. The details blurred over time, but the feeling did not. Even those who had not lived through it sensed that something had shifted here long ago. Absence became part of the landscape. It lingered in empty lots where buildings had been torn down, in houses renovated so thoroughly they erased their own pasts, in the school corridors where names were no longer spoken but never quite forgotten. These spaces carried memory without explanation, like echoes with no clear source. For those who remembered, the echoes were sharper. They noticed how certain streets felt different at dusk, how the sound of children walking home triggered a reflexive pause, how doors were watched just a second longer than necessary. These behaviors were subtle, almost unnoticeable, but they were learned responses, habits shaped by loss. The hidden room, though sealed again, never truly disappeared. It existed now as an idea more than a place, a symbol that lived beyond walls and measurements. It represented not just what had been concealed, but what people are capable of overlooking when familiarity replaces vigilance. It became a quiet lesson passed down without ceremony. Some residents avoided the house entirely. Others passed it often, unable to stop themselves from glancing at it, even after renovations softened its appearance. No matter how ordinary it looked, it carried a gravity that could not be painted over. The knowledge of what had been hidden there clung stubbornly, refusing to fade. Memory does not obey renovations. The families continued forward, because time insists on movement even when hearts resist it. Lives were lived, careers built, children raised, laughter returned, though sometimes with an edge of restraint. Grief did not disappear. It integrated, becoming part of identity rather than its definition. They learned how to hold joy carefully. Anniversaries still came. Some marked quietly. Others passed unnoticed until the day ended and realization struck like a soft blow. Grief no longer demanded attention, but it never released its claim. It lived comfortably in the background, familiar and persistent. There were moments, unexpected, unguarded, when memories surged without warning. A face in a crowd, a voice that sounded almost right, a mannerism that felt too familiar. These moments did not offer hope anymore. They offered connection, a reminder that love does not require presence to endure. The town learned that closure is not a moment. It is a process of acceptance layered over years, shaped by repetition and restraint. It does not arrive with certainty or explanation. It arrives when people stop asking time to give back what it cannot. Yet the mystery never fully released its hold. Even decades later, people still wondered. Quietly, privately. The questions had softened, but they remained, not because answers were expected, but because forgetting felt wrong. Wondering was a form of remembrance. The story became less about disappearance and more about consequence, about how one ordinary morning could fracture a community's sense of safety, how trust could delay action, how assumptions could protect silence. These were not accusations. They were realizations, uncomfortable but necessary. The town carried these lessons forward, imperfectly. Parents watched more closely, but not fearfully. They taught awareness without panic. They spoke about safety without turning the world into something monstrous. Balance was hard-earned here, shaped by experience rather than theory. The echoes persisted. They lived in a way the town responded to future uncertainties. With more questions, more attention, more willingness to look again at what seemed already known. The disappearance had left behind a kind of vigilance that did not fade. Some nights, when the streets emptied and the town settled into sleep, the quiet felt similar to that first night long ago, but not the same. This silence was informed. It carried memory rather than ignorance. It knew what absence meant, and sometimes that made all the difference. The children who never returned did not remain frozen in time. They lived on in imagined futures, in remembered details, in the subtle ways the town changed because of them. Their story did not end where they disappeared. It continued in every choice shaped by awareness, every moment of attention paid where it once might not have been. This is how echoes work. They do not repeat the original sound exactly. They transform it, carry it forward, alter its shape while preserving its essence. What began as an unanswered disappearance became something else entirely, a quiet force that reshaped lives without ever fully revealing itself. There was no final revelation to close the story, no definitive ending to satisfy curiosity or erase doubt. The truth, partial and heavy, remained what it had always been, something to live with, not resolve. And perhaps that was the most honest ending possible. The town did not forget. It learned how to remember without reopening wounds, how to honor absence without being consumed by it. The hidden room became part of history, but the lessons it revealed remained active, present, and unresolved. Some mysteries do not ask to be solved. They ask to be carried. And so the story lingered, not loudly, not dramatically, but faithfully, in memory, in caution, in the quiet understanding that what is hidden is not always far away, and that the ordinary can hold more than it shows. They left for school and never returned. And half a century later, even with walls open and truths partially revealed, the echo of that morning still moved through the town, soft, persistent, and impossible to silence.